I sat at the head of the long oak table in the room where my wife and I once counted our very first payroll by hand. My son-in-law placed a folder in front of me and tapped it twice, like he was tapping a coffin shut. "Now that Eleanor's gone, this business needs a man who actually understands numbers, Frank," he said, and behind him my daughter Paige did not defend me. She just watched me with a small, satisfied smile, the kind you give someone when you already know how the story ends. I did not raise my voice. I unscrewed the cap of my pen, looked at both of them, and asked one simple question about my grandson's birth certificate. The color drained out of my son-in-law's face so fast I thought he might faint right there in his $3,000 suit. "Before I tell you exactly what was on that certificate, and how I made both of them regret ever sitting at my table, let me know where you're watching from tonight, sweetheart, and hit that follow button if you've ever had family try to bury you before you were even in the ground. To understand how we got to that unbearable moment, you need to go back 6 days, to the morning after I buried the only woman I ever loved. The house was too quiet without Eleanor in it. 43 years of marriage does not prepare a man for silence like that. I stood in our kitchen in Millbrook, Ohio, holding her favorite coffee mug, the one with the chip on the handle she refused to throw away, and I just stood there letting the water run cold over my hands. Eleanor had died of a stroke 8 days earlier, fast and cruel, the kind of death that doesn't give you time to say the things you meant to say for 40 years. We built Whitfield Millworks together, starting with one second-hand table saw in a rented garage back in 1979. We turned that saw into a custom furniture company that now supplied hotels and restaurants across 3 states, worth close to $11 million. Eleanor kept the books. I kept the promises to every carpenter who ever worked for us. And now, before the dirt on her grave had even settled, my daughter and her husband were already circling. That morning, I heard heels clicking across my hardwood floor, sharp and fast, like a countdown. Paige walked into the kitchen without knocking, and there was not a trace of red in her eyes, not a single sign that she had spent the last week grieving her own mother. She was dressed like she had somewhere important to be. She set a thick folder on my counter, right next to Eleanor's reading glasses, which I hadn't been able to move yet. "This is just a formality, Dad," she said, sliding it toward me. I looked down. "Emergency transition of executive authority," the top page read. My son-in-law, Grant Whitcomb, walked in a moment later, dressed like he was headed to a shareholder meeting instead of his mother-in-law's kitchen 6 days after her funeral. "It's for your own protection, Frank," Grant said smoothly, resting a hand on the counter like he already owned it. "You're 72. You just lost Eleanor. Nobody expects you to keep running a company through something like this. We think it's best if the trust transfers operational control to Tyler for now, with Paige and I overseeing things day to day." Tyler was my grandson. 19 years old, more interested in his truck's exhaust system than in a single balance sheet Whitfield Millworks had ever produced. I felt something cold settle low in my stomach. This company was not wood and varnish to me. It was every Christmas Eleanor and I skipped. Every winter we drove that second-hand delivery van through ice storms because we couldn't afford to lose a single client. "The company is running fine," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm grieving, Paige. I'm not incompetent." Grant's jaw tightened. He reminded me, gently at first and then less gently, that my doctor had flagged my blood pressure last spring, that everyone was simply concerned, that all I needed to do was sign and rest and let the next generation carry the weight for a while. It was a beautiful lie, wrapped in the language of love. I told them I needed time to read the paperwork properly before I signed anything. Grant's smile flickered, just barely, like a light bulb about to die. "Don't take too long, Frank," he said. "The board meets Friday." They left without so much as offering to make me a cup of coffee in my own kitchen. Through the reflection in my dark kitchen window, as they walked to their car, I watched Paige pull out her phone and type something quickly, smiling the whole time. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I recognized the look of a hunter who believes the trap has already worked. The next morning, I drove to the shop before sunrise, the way I had almost every day since 1979. I needed to stand among the sawdust and the half-finished dining tables to remember who I was before I became a grieving old widower in my own family's eyes. My badge didn't work at the side door. Red light. I tried it 3 times before a voice called out behind me. "Having some trouble there, Frank?" It was Dale Pruitt, our accounting director, walking toward me with a coffee in hand. and a smile that didn't match the hour. Dale explained, far too casually, that Grant had ordered a full security system overhaul over the weekend. Something about protecting sensitive company data, and that I'd probably want to go home and rest instead. Grant ordered it, not the board. Not me. I nodded, thanked Dale for the information, and walked calmly back to my truck, my hands steady, even though my blood was boiling underneath. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of watching an old man lose his temper in a parking lot. I drove home and went straight to my study, to the bottom drawer of my desk where I kept an old external hard drive Eleanor never even knew existed. Years earlier, after a bitter dispute with a former business partner, I'd had a programmer build a hidden backup system into our servers, one that mirrored every financial record we ever produced, completely outside the main network. I plugged it in, ready to see exactly what Grant and Dale were hiding behind their sudden security upgrade. Before I could type a single password, my cell phone rang. The caller ID said Riverside County Hospital. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. A woman's voice on the other end told me my grandson Tyler had been in a serious car accident and that the family needed to come immediately. I slammed the laptop shut and ran for my keys. The drive to the hospital was a blur of red lights and a pounding heart. I ran through the sliding doors and found Paige pacing the hallway, phone in hand, more irritated than afraid. Grant sat slumped in a plastic chair, his face pale, his tie loosened like he'd been choking on it. "What happened?" I demanded, gripping his shoulder. Grant explained that Tyler had lost control on a wet road and hit a guardrail, that he had internal bleeding but no head trauma, thank God, but that the doctors needed to move fast. A tired-looking physician came through the double doors a few minutes later, his scrubs stained, his voice grave. Tyler was stable for now, but his hemoglobin was dropping dangerously low, and the hospital's blood bank had been drained by a multi-vehicle pileup earlier that week. They needed a direct family donor immediately. "Your grandson has a rare blood type," the doctor said, looking between Grant and Paige. "He's AB negative. We need you both in the lab right now for cross-matching." The world went very quiet around me. I am O positive. Eleanor was O positive. Simple biology, the kind I remembered from a high school class 60 years ago, says that two O positive parents cannot produce an AB child under any circumstance. My daughter, Paige, was our biological child. No question there. I'd raised her myself since the day she was born. But my son-in-law Grant's blood type had come up years earlier during a minor medical scare, and I remembered it clearly. Type A. An O mother and an A father could produce an A child, or occasionally an O child. Never AB. Never in 100 years. I turned my head slowly and looked at Grant. I expected confusion. Instead, I saw a man staring at the floor like it might open up and swallow him whole, sweat beading along his hairline despite the hospital's air conditioning. He would not look at me. He would not look at his own son's father. He knew. Paige, in that same moment, was loudly, aggressively demanding the doctor arrange an emergency transport of blood from a private facility, waving her credit card like it could bend biology itself. Deliberately, I now realize, distracting everyone from the fact that she could not offer her own blood without exposing something. The doctor, unmoved by her money, arranged for an emergency transfer instead, and within a few tense hours, Tyler was stabilized. I played my part perfectly. I hugged Grant. I told Paige I was proud of how she was handling the crisis. Then I drove home, and instead of grieving, I began planning. I did not confront Grant that night in the hallway. You never corner a wounded animal in the open. I learned that lesson decades ago in far uglier negotiations than this one. Instead, 2 days later, I invited him to get coffee with me alone, away from Paige, in the cafeteria in the basement of that same hospital, while we waited on some final paperwork for Tyler's discharge. The cafeteria smelled like burnt coffee and bleach, and we sat in a corner booth where nobody could hear us. "I have to admit," I said, keeping my tone light, almost apologetic. "The doctor said Tyler is AB negative. Eleanor and I were both O positive. You're an A if I remember right from that scare a few years back. How exactly does that work out?" Grant's hand shook so badly the coffee nearly spilled over the rim of his cup. He did not look confused. He looked cornered. "You're grieving and confused, Frank," he snapped, his voice cracking with something close to panic. "It's probably a clerical error. Hospitals mess up blood types all the time. Don't turn this into one of your investigations." But I had spent 40 years reading men across negotiating tables, and I knew exactly what genuine confusion looked like, and exactly what guilt dressed up as offense looked like too. He was not confused. He was terrified. I let the silence between us stretch until it became unbearable, until he finally broke eye contact completely and stared into his coffee like it held the answers he refused to give me. "You're probably right," I said softly, standing up to leave. "Must just be a clerical error. After all, what other explanation could there possibly be?" I walked away and left him sitting there, drowning quietly in whatever he was hiding. That night, I drove to their house under the excuse of dropping off a casserole, my heart steady, my hands calm. While Grant heated up the food, I slipped upstairs under the pretense of checking on Tyler, who was resting with headphones on, oblivious to the storm gathering around him. In the boy's bathroom, I found his toothbrush, still slightly damp, and sealed it carefully into a small plastic bag I'd brought in my coat pocket. On my way back down, I detoured through the garage, where Grant kept his gym bag on a hook by the door, a creature of habit even in crisis. Buried in the collar of his sweat-damp workout shirt were 2 dark hairs, roots intact. I collected them just as carefully. I stayed another 10 minutes, played the part of the exhausted, grieving father-in-law, and left with the quiet destruction of their entire world sealed inside my coat pocket. I drove 2 towns over to a private lab that operated after hours, the kind of place that asks no questions when you hand over $5,000 in cash for an expedited paternity analysis. The technician promised results within 48 hours. As I walked back to my truck under a cold, clear sky, my phone buzzed violently in my pocket, an automated alert from the same hidden backdoor system I'd built into Whitfield's servers years earlier. Someone was attempting to authorize an unapproved wire transfer of just over $3 million, using a spoofed version of my own digital signature. I did not drive to the office. I drove straight home, locked myself in my study, and logged into the hidden system myself for the first time in a decade. I traced the login directly to Dale Pruitt's desk at the office, working at 6 in the morning, clumsily trying to disguise a transfer meant for what turned out to be 4 shell companies registered out of state, with names so generic they blended perfectly into a routine expense report. I froze the transaction before it could complete, trapping the money in limbo where Dale could neither move it nor erase the trail. Then I dug deeper, and what I found made my stomach turn over completely. The money wasn't coming from company profits. It was being siphoned directly from the employee retirement fund, the pensions of the very carpenters and drivers who had built Whitfield Millworks alongside Eleanor and me for over 4 decades. And when I lined up the dates, the first withdrawal had happened the exact week Eleanor received her stroke diagnosis, the week I was at her bedside instead of at my desk. They had used my grief as cover, timed their theft to the exact moment my attention was guaranteed to be elsewhere. 2 days later, the lab called. I drove there alone, sat in my truck in their parking lot, and opened the envelope with hands that did not shake. Not anymore. Probability of paternity, 0.00%. Grant Whitcomb was not Tyler's biological father. I sat there for exactly 1 minute, letting myself grieve the grandson I'd spent 19 years believing was my own blood, grateful, in a strange way, that Eleanor had passed before ever having to learn this. Then the grief burned away into something colder, something with purpose. If Grant wasn't Tyler's father, then someone else was. Someone close enough to the family to keep the secret buried for nearly 2 decades. Someone with intimate knowledge of how to move money without triggering alarms. Dale Pruitt. I hired a retired federal investigator named Curtis Boone, a man built like a retired linebacker with the patience of a chess master. I handed him a blank check and one instruction. Start with Dale Pruitt and Paige. 3 days later, we met at a diner off the interstate, and Curtis slid a thick folder across a sticky table. Photographs of Paige and Dale together at a hotel outside the county. Years of receipts, plane tickets, a relationship going back over 20 years, long before Paige ever married Grant. They had met in college. When neither of them had family money to build the life they wanted, they had made a decision. Paige would marry into stability, and Dale would find his way into the company's finances. Tyler had been born less than a year into her marriage to Grant. Curtis confirmed it with a second sample. Dale Pruitt was Tyler's biological father, but the worst was still coming. Curtis pulled out a printed email, recovered from an old deleted server, dated 10 years earlier. It was from Grant to Paige, He had gone in for testing after years of failed attempts for a second child, and the results were final. Grant was completely sterile, the result of an illness in his 20s. If my late wife Eleanor, who had insisted on a bloodline clause protecting our family trust, ever discovered Grant could not father children, our estate would bypass him and Paige entirely and go to charity. So they built the lie together. Grant knew. He had known for 10 years that Tyler wasn't his son, and instead of telling the truth, he chose to protect his access to $11 million, raising another man's child as his own and lying to my face at every holiday dinner for a decade. I did not confront them immediately. I called my attorney, Marcus Reyes, a man who had spent 30 years dismantling corporate fraud in courtrooms across the state, and told him everything. Prepare the paperwork, I said. Disinheritance, termination, breach of the bloodline clause, and get in touch with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit about the pension fraud. We're going to let them believe they've won first. For the next several days, I played the broken old man perfectly. I let my shoulders slump. I told Grant and Paige I'd finally decided to sign the papers, that grief had simply worn me down, that I wanted Tyler to hold the family trust with them, managing daily operations. Paige's eyes lit up with barely concealed victory when I told her. She promised to have the final documents ready by Friday's board meeting. I thanked her, and she never once noticed the stillness underneath my trembling hands. Friday morning, I put on the charcoal suit I hadn't worn since I closed our biggest hotel supply contract a decade earlier. I walked into that boardroom with my spine straight and every head turned in shock at the sight of a man who was supposed to be finished. Paige sat in my old chair at the head of the table, radiating triumph. Grant beside her, Tyler scrolling on his phone further down, Dale smirking with his arms crossed. A folder slid down the table toward me, a gold pen resting on top. Now that Eleanor's gone, Paige said, her voice dripping with the same venom from 6 days earlier. This business needs someone who actually understands numbers, Frank. You're done here. Sign it. I picked up the pen, held it for a long moment, looked at Grant one final time to see if any shred of decency remained in him. He looked away. I set the pen down without signing a single word. The doors swung open. Marcus walked in, flanked by 2 federal agents. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He announced that a legally certified paternity test, obtained independently 48 hours earlier, proved Tyler was not the biological child of Grant Whitcomb, rendering the entire trust transfer null and void under the bloodline clause my late wife had insisted on years before. Tyler's phone dropped from his hand and clattered onto the table. Paige's confident smirk cracked into something ugly and desperate. Dale tried to stand, and one of the agents forced him back into his chair. Marcus continued, his voice steady as granite, explaining that this same investigation had uncovered a systematic embezzlement of $3 million from the company's employee pension fund, funneled through shell corporations registered by Dale Pruitt with Paige's direct knowledge and assistance. The agents read them their rights on the spot. Grant, suddenly desperate to save himself, screamed at Paige, calling her a liar, insisting he'd been deceived too, conveniently forgetting the email sitting in my briefcase that proved otherwise. I pulled it out and threw it onto the table in front of him. He read his own handwriting, and his fake outrage died instantly, replaced by silence and shame. I handed Grant an eviction notice for the house I had paid for and a termination letter for the position he no longer deserved. I told him he had known for 10 years and chosen greed over honesty, and that he would receive nothing from my estate, not $1, and that he was never to contact me again. Paige was let out in handcuffs, screaming that she deserved half of everything she claimed to have built. Dale went quietly, his arrogance finally extinguished by the weight of federal charges. I turned to Tyler last, sitting frozen and pale at the far end of the table, a boy who had done nothing except be born into a lie he never asked for. None of this is your fault, I told him gently, the only softness I allowed myself that entire morning. But you are not entitled to this family's name or its money anymore. I will pay for your college and cover your living expenses for exactly 1 year. After that, you build your own life. Use the time wisely. He nodded, tears sliding down his face, and thanked me quietly before walking out. 6 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom and watched Paige and Dale sentenced to 12 years each for wire fraud and embezzlement. Grant, stripped of everything, now worked a retail job across town, learning too late the value of an honest dollar. I rehired every loyal employee Grant had pushed out during his brief reign, and together we recovered every stolen cent, restoring it fully to the pension fund so no carpenter or driver would ever lose a night's sleep over what those three had done. Then I stood on the roof of the building Eleanor and I built from a single table saw, and I signed new papers of my own, half of everything into a scholarship fund in her name for working-class kids who wanted to learn a trade, the other half into an ownership program for every employee who had ever bled alongside us to build this place. Family, I've come to understand, isn't defined by blood or by the name on a marriage certificate. It's defined by loyalty, plain and simple, the kind that doesn't disappear the moment things get hard. And every single night since, when I sit alone in that quiet house, I still hear Eleanor's voice reminding me that a man who built something honest never has to be afraid of losing it, not even to the people who were supposed to love him most. Real love doesn't slam folders on a counter or smile at a funeral. It shows up quietly, in coffee you didn't ask for, in decades of blizzard deliveries, in the patience to wait for truth instead of screaming for it. Money can be stolen, titles can be forged, but loyalty built honestly over a lifetime always finds its way back to the light. Keep building that kind of love. It outlasts everyone who never deserved it. A small note for you. This story was imagined and written by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its heartfelt lesson still found a little place in your day.